Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Steele. In this session, I'm going to look at groups. Now, let me be clear. Any short video about groups by a sociologist has got to be suspect. I mean, after all, in sociology, that's what we talk about, groups. But let me at least try to lay out for you some basics. And believe me, these are really the basics. So if you really need more depth, you should go to a good textbook or talk to a solid sociology professor about groups. It's important stuff, but I'm just going to look at the basics. First, let's start out with the notion of groups versus non-groups. You know, every time you see a bunch of people on the street, we probably call them a group. Well, the reality, it's not really true if you really stick to the actual definition of a group. A bunch of people just clustered in some place, it may be a group, but we're more likely to call that an aggregate. An aggregate's just a collection of people. They don't necessarily have any common interaction or any sort of common identity. They're just there. Now, it turns out that all groups are aggregates, but not all aggregates are groups. And we'll see what I mean by that in a little bit. Another example of this is of something that's a non-group is a crowd. A crowd's a bunch of people that get together for some common stimulus, like a sports game or a rock concert. They're all there for some reason, but they don't necessarily all interact with one another. You can study this a little bit more, mass behavior and riots and crowds, all clusters of people, by looking at collective behavior. I mean, that's what the sociologists call it. They make a distinction between group thinking and group discussions and something they call collective behavior. So if you're looking for crowds and you're looking for riots and mobs and other kinds of collections that are not groups but are clusters of people, look under collective behavior. I'm not looking at that today. What I would like to do is to look at some of the characteristics of a bunch of people that really make them a group. And I'm going to rely on my good colleague and friend's work, Earl Babbie, a contemporary sociologist. Earl says that there are like 4 things that really characterize a bunch of people as a group. First, shared interests. Now, this idea is important to see that the word shared doesn't mean common. We can have brown eyes in common. We can be left-handed in common. We can even wear the same shirt in common. But we may not share brown-eyedness or shirt-coloredness. We may not share that. When you share something, you take that inside you, and you also maintain it with somebody else simultaneously. So if in fact something's a group, there are shared interests. 2 or more people actually hold on to that same thing. The second item that Earl talks about is group identity. Now, you probably understand the concept of identity from psychology class. Who you are is your individual identity. We could say something similar for groups. Who people collectively define themselves to be is the group identity. It's a we feeling, a sort of consciousness of kind. Every person, or to greater or lesser degree, who's a member of a group shares that same sort of identity. And we can see this often with sort of subcultures and families. We can see it in the military with groups of people who may call themselves Marines. They have this identity which is shared with others, and they make it part of themselves. Thirdly, there's this notion that when you have a group, you have structure. Now, sociologists talk about structure all the time, and quite honestly, it's important stuff. But I gotta be honest with you, it took me a long time to understand what that was all about. Turns out that in its all simple case, structure are sets and systems of norms. Remember, rules? And these come up from collective values, things of worth, and beliefs, things that we commonly know. So a group then has a set of normative behavior, structured behavior. It's kind of like the notion that if you start thinking about the building superstructure, like the girders that support a building, they support the outside of that building. In and of themselves, they support that very thing. Metaphorically, the norms that are shared by a group support collective human action. They're the rules for that group. And then finally, Earl Babby points out that interaction is a pretty important thing. In fact, it's the stuff of sociology. You know that sociology is the scientific study of human interaction with an emphasis on groups. And without interaction, sociologists don't have much to talk about. In order to have a group, you've got to have interaction. Now, I didn't say it has to be in the same place. Certainly, it could happen online or on the internet or a variety of other ways. But action between people, interaction or among people, absolutely essential for groupness. Okay, so those are the basic four things. Let's go on from there. Let's talk about a couple of types of groups. And these are the very basic kind that one would learn in an introduction to sociology class. But I'm going to tell you that if you're trying to apply sociology, even these basic ideas are pretty powerful. Let's take a look at a couple of them. First one was the one that was offered by Charles Horton Cooley way back in the early 1900s. He wrote a book called The Primary Group. The primary group, he had a sort of notion that it was an intimate face-to-face association, and he thought of things like families and friends. But this term has become more generalized now in sociology to mean any sort of small, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, subjective, that is to say it has its own internal set of norms, and I would argue often largely emergent sets of norms that are made by that group itself, that support the small groups' socio-emotional, personal, and group needs. So, we all think about families, of course, when we think of this. But then, of course, if you've ever been in love, okay, chances are you've created a primary group. I mean, just think of all the time you spent with that person that you love, trying to make up little languages and the very subjective sorts of rules for interaction. And if you don't think there are rules in primary groups, just see what happens when you're supposed to pick her up on time and you don't. You'll see there really are norms and values in those small groups. Secondary groups, on the other hand, are far more objective. There are norms and structures that are there probably before you ever got there. These are usually larger groups, and they can be hundreds, thousands, even hundreds of thousands sometimes of people. And they're characterized by this kind of impersonal normative behavior. In other words, a company like General Motors or Microsoft has a company policy that people have to follow. And that company policy is a set of rules for action. There's probably a detailed set of rules and norms for what happens when you want to take your vacation. How many days of vacation you get. How often you can take vacation. When you can take vacation are probably all outlined in a bureaucracy that surrounds Microsoft or General Motors or Sony, for example. These norms are there whether you're there or not, and whether you like it or not. And what this does is it provides large-scale instrumental relationships. By that I mean that lots of work can get done because the norms are understood and they're similar for everybody. And it turns out that that makes it possible for these large groups to actually function quite efficiently. We always hear terms, a bureaucracy is such a group, a secondary group, and we always hear about how bureaucracies are inefficient. Well, the reality is that Western civilization and actually global civilizations moved ahead pretty well when the concept of the bureaucracy as a social form was introduced. I mean, we can see things like declines in mortality rates and efficiencies in terms of how many things could be produced, like mass assembly lines. All these things did in fact improve life. What we hear about all the time are sort of the cold, objective errors that are made. And very often when a secondary group makes an error, because of its size and its structure, it may very well make a big one. But by and large, the billions of interactions that go into secondary groups more than outweigh sometimes the problems that they produce. Now let's look at a couple others, and these other kind of group types are probably more interactionist in their nature. I'd like to look at reference groups, and these are pretty self-defining. Reference groups are very simply groups from which you take your norms and values. or you take who you are from these groups. It might be your family, but also it could be a political party, it could be your school, it could be a group of friends that are a clique of friends, and you take your norms and values from them. You refer to them when you're trying to think about what you should do and who you are. If you're trying now to study to become a nurse or a physician, or if you're interested in being a teacher or a IT professional, you may very well look at that cluster of careers and career expectations as your reference group. And hence, you take a little bit of your personal identity from them. And related to those are in-groups and out-groups. Pretty simple stuff, but very powerful, because how people collectively define themselves, whether they feel like they're part of an in-group or part of an out-group, has some really important ramifications. In-groups are certainly groups that for which you not only take reference, but you feel like you're comfortable with. You're familiar with them. You're part of them. You own their sort of identity. You're not uncomfortable being either identified with them or saying that you'd go along with them. On the other hand, outgroups are groups that you just don't want to have any part of. And so what we start to see is that while those are sort of simple and powerful issues, they become the basis for belief systems and actions. And when this happens, some very serious things can happen. The war on terrorism is such an example. And the issues that are surrounding those in terms of in-groups and out-groups are probably pretty obvious. Various groups label certain persons as out-groups, and others label those very same people perhaps as in-groups. Depending on how these are defined, and depending on where you stand relative to those in and out groups, may have a lot to do with what you do. Okay, well, so much for those very basic kinds of groups. Clearly, as I pointed out earlier, there's no way that we can cover all the kinds of groups in a very short video. But it is important to think about those basic ones, and I'll tell you why. You can do some pretty powerful things just thinking about those pieces. Let's take an example. Now what I'd like to do is sort of take an applied approach to this. After all, if you're watching this video, it may be for Intro to Soc, but more than likely, you're going to see this in an applied sociology course. So the big question is not what are these groups and what are their characteristics. We've already done that. But rather, can I make a group? How would I do it? Well, let's look at a sort of basic recipe for a group. How would you make one? Okay? Well, first of all, you got to have a bunch of people. Now, that bunch could be together, or it could be on other continents if you're using the internet. So it turns out that the only thing that's really important there is that that bunch be there and that they have the capability for interaction. The second thing that you need to look at is can you construct, or can you determine or find out or make a set of shared interests? You got to make it clear that they are shared, that the people, whether they're present or on the internet or face to face, have some sort of common mission or a common goal. It might be some valued outcome, something that the group wants to do, and that people share that desire. Thirdly, that what you need to do is beyond the people, number 1, 2, shared interests. Third, can you reinforce group identity? What are we all about? Now, interestingly, this can come from a lot of directions. You can impose that on people and hope that and socialize them to make this group identity, or it can have an emergent quality. You can let people figure it out for themselves. Ask them to brainstorm it. You're going to have to interact eventually to do this, and of course, that emergent identity may come from people collectively determining just what their group identity is. The fourth thing is that ultimately there'll be some group structure. If you leave it alone and you have interaction going on and you declare that this is going to be a group, some norms, some rules and values and beliefs will emerge one way or the other. They may be just de facto, they may be informal, but rules will come about as people try to figure out what to do in this particular collective order. Now, on the other hand, of course, you can impose group structure. You know what happened the last time that you went out to get a new job. Chances are you had to find out what the group structure was, and people ask you to behave accordingly. And hence the group structure supports collective action. So, you can impose this and ask people to internalize it, or you can ask them to create it. And sometimes that works out well too, particularly in smaller groups. And fifth, and most importantly, you've got to deal with interaction. You've got to set up situations where people are acting together, whether it's playing games, living together, doing group projects, whatever it might be. Interaction, action between people is the key to groupness. If you're trying to make a group, you're going to probably want to set up some situations where people are interacting with one another. So ultimately, if you take this recipe for groups, get a bunch of people, determine shared interests, create a group identity, create group structure, and cause them to interact, you probably will reinforce the notion that this particular bunch of people is now moving toward a group. You can see that these things are like dimensions, if you will. Not everybody will share the same interests. Not everybody will hold on to the group identity, and it may take a while. Not everyone will adhere to the group structure, and there'll maybe be people challenging it and acting in a deviant way. And ultimately, some people will isolate themselves and not be part of the group in terms of interaction. Nonetheless, and so you can imagine that as we think about this, these four dimensions can be seen as a kind of structure or a continuum. And if we're high on all four of these items, in other words, shared interests, group identity, and group structure and interaction, well, chances are better that we'll have a group. If we're low on any of them, less likely. And if we're low on all of them, probably not likely at all. Well, at any rate, it was a short video. There's a lot more to be said about groups. And again, as I reinforce this, I hope you'll spend some time studying groups beyond this video. But this will just give you a basic idea of what groupness is, some basic ways of making a group, and some different types of groups. You know what? Have a good day.